The sterile recycled air of the Boeing 777 hummed with the quiet anticipation of travel. Flight 815 from Atlanta to Seattle was full. A metal tube packed with stories, deadlines, and reunions. In seat 12B, a man in a tailored charcoal suit adjusted his tie, his face a mask of calm professionalism. But from the fortified cockpit, Captain Richard Sterling watched him on a security monitor, and a cold, ugly certainty began to curdle in his gut. He keyed his intercom, his voice a low growl that cut through the pre-flight chatter. "We have a problem," he said, and with those 4 words, he set in motion a chain of events that would shatter careers, expose a dark prejudice, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous threat on an airplane isn't a passenger, it's the man in the captain's seat. The Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was a symphony of controlled chaos. The squeak of suitcase wheels, the distant garbled announcements over the PA system, and the low thrum of thousands of conversations blended into a single kinetic roar. It was a place of transitions, a concrete and glass purgatory between where people had been and where they were going. For David Roberts, sitting in the bustling terminal near Gate C-34, it was simply another stop in a life lived in motion. He was a man who cultivated anonymity. His suit was expensive, but understated, his shoes polished, but practical. At 42, his face was beginning to show the faint lines of long nights and intense concentration, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He scanned the crowd, not with the idle curiosity of a bored traveler, but with the practiced, systematic gaze of a predator searching for a break in the pattern. He sipped his black coffee, the bitter taste, a familiar anchor in the shifting tides of his work. His boarding pass for Trans-American Airways Flight 815 to Seattle was tucked neatly into the inside pocket of his jacket, next to a wallet that contained far more than cash and credit cards. In the cockpit of that same flight, Captain Richard "Rick" Sterling was performing his own pre-flight ritual. At 58, he was the personification of the classic airline pilot. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his uniform immaculate, and his jaw perpetually set in a look of grim authority. He had flown for the Air Force for 20 years before transitioning to commercial aviation, and he carried that military rigidity with him like a shield. To him, the cockpit was not just a workspace, it was his kingdom, and his word was absolute law. "Checklist complete on my end, Captain," said his first officer, Evan Hayes. Evan was younger, barely 30, and still possessed a sense of wonder about the miracle of flight that Sterling had long since traded for cynicism. He respected Sterling's experience, but often found his old-school attitude grating. "Acknowledged." Sterling grunted, his eyes flicking over the array of glowing instruments. He glanced at the small CCTV monitor that showed the jet bridge watching the passengers file aboard. It was a habit, a self-appointed security measure. He saw them all as potential problems until the landing gear retracted. Families with screaming kids, anxious-looking students, overconfident businessmen talking too loudly on their phones. He categorized and dismissed them with a practiced prejudice. Then he saw David Roberts. Roberts walked onto the plane with a fluid, confident stride. He wasn't looking at his phone or fumbling with his bags. His head was up, his eyes scanning the cabin. To a casual observer, he was just another business traveler. To Captain Sterling, he was an anomaly, a black man dressed in a suit that looked too good for him, carrying himself with an air of authority that in Sterling's warped view he hadn't earned. The pilot's mind, a repository of decades of ingrained biases, immediately flagged him. "You see that guy?" Sterling muttered, nodding toward the screen. Evan leaned forward. "Which one, the man in the suit?" "Yeah, seat 12B. Sterling said, his voice tight. "Something's not right about him." Evan squinted at the monitor. "What do you mean, Captain? He looks like a businessman, probably heading to Seattle for a meeting with Amazon or Microsoft." "No," Sterling insisted, a note of finality in his tone. It's a gut feeling. 20,000 hours in the air, you develop a sense for these things. He's too calm, too observant. It's an act. Evan sat back, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He knew this side of Sterling. The captain had a reputation for being difficult, for seeing threats where there were none, particularly when those perceived threats didn't fit his narrow worldview. Captain, with all due respect, a gut feeling isn't grounds for anything. He hasn't done a single thing wrong. Sterling ignored him. He watched as David Roberts stowed his single carry-on bag in the overhead compartment with practiced efficiency and took his seat. The lead flight attendant, a seasoned professional named Sarah Jenkins, greeted him with a polite smile which Roberts returned. Everything was perfectly normal. But in Sterling's mind, the alarm bells were screaming. This wasn't caution. It was a deep-seated, irrational conviction. He picked up the intercom handset that connected directly to the cabin crew. "Sarah, this is the captain." "Go ahead, Captain," her voice chirped back, still bright with her customer service demeanor. "The passenger in 12B, I want you to keep an eye on him." There was a slight pause. "Sir, the gentleman in the charcoal suit." "That's the one," Sterling said. "He's setting off my alarms. Just watch him. Any sudden movements, any suspicious behavior, you let me know immediately." "Captain," Sarah replied, her voice now laced with confusion. "He's just sitting here reading a magazine. He's been perfectly polite. Is there something specific I should be looking for?" Sterling's patience snapped. "Just do what I told you, Jenkins. It's a security issue." He clicked off the intercom, leaving a stunned silence in the galley. In the right-hand seat, Evan Hayes stared straight ahead, his hands clenched on his knees. He knew this was wrong. He had seen Sterling do this before, albeit in less extreme ways, demanding extra scrutiny for passengers with Middle Eastern names, making derogatory comments about women in the cabin. But this was different. This was a direct, targeted accusation based on nothing more than the man's appearance. "Captain," Evan said, his voice low and steady, "I need to log this. You are raising a security concern about a passenger based on a gut feeling. Can you give me anything more specific for the record?" Sterling turned to him, his blue eyes like ice chips. "My authority as captain of this aircraft is all the record you need, First Officer. The safety of this flight is my responsibility, and I'm telling you that man is a threat. Now, are you going to help me ensure the safety of this plane, or are you going to be a problem?" The threat hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Evan knew that challenging Sterling directly could be career suicide. An influential captain's negative report could ground a co-pilot for years. He swallowed his objections, the metallic taste of compromise in his mouth. For now, he would watch and wait, hoping the captain's paranoia would subside. But as the final passengers boarded and the cabin doors were prepared for closing, Rick Sterling wasn't subsiding. He was doubling down. He watched David Roberts on the screen, his prejudice twisting the man's calm demeanor into a sinister mask. In his mind, Roberts wasn't a passenger anymore. He was a problem to be eliminated, and Captain Sterling was about to take his first irreversible step toward doing just that. The low chime indicating the cabin doors were armed and cross-checked echoed through the aircraft. Sarah Jenkins made the standard pre-departure announcement, her voice smooth and professional, betraying none of the tension coiling in her stomach from the captain's bizarre instruction. Passengers settled in phones were switched to airplane mode, and the familiar dance of departure began, all except in the cockpit. "I've made a decision," Sterling announced, his knuckles white as he gripped the yoke. "We're not taking off with him on board." Evan's head snapped around. "What, Captain? You can't be serious. On what grounds? We'll have to file a report. Give a specific reason." "Gut feeling isn't going to fly with the FAA or the company." "My reason," Sterling said, his voice dangerously low, "is that I, as pilot in command, have deemed him a security risk to this flight. That is all the reason I need. It is my prerogative. It is my duty. A security risk for what?" Reading The Economist, Evan shot back his fear, now eclipsed by a rising sense of disbelief and anger. "Rick, think about what you're doing. You're about to delay a flight with over 200 people and single out a passenger for removal for no reason other than you don't like the way he looks. This will not end well. It will end with him off my plane, Sterling retorted. His eyes glued to the small screen. He saw David Roberts turn a page, his expression unreadable. To Sterling, this was proof of a cold, calculating nature. He was convinced he was staring at a wolf in sheep's clothing. He keyed the intercom again. "Sarah, I need you to come to the cockpit." A moment later, Sarah slipped through the cockpit door, her expression a mixture of anxiety and professionalism. "Yes, Captain." "Inform the passenger in 12B that he needs to deplane. The gate agent will meet him on the jet bridge." Sarah's jaw literally dropped. "Captain, I can't do that." "For what reason? What do I tell him? The man has done absolutely nothing." "You will tell him," Sterling enunciated, as if speaking to a child, "that the captain has exercised his authority and is denying him passage. It's not a negotiation. Have him gather his belongings and escort him to the forward door." "No," Sarah said, her voice shaking but firm. "I won't do it. That's discrimination. It's wrong, and I will not be a part of it." Sterling's face purpled with rage. He was being challenged by his own crew. "This is insubordination, Jenkins. You're risking your job." "My job isn't worth ruining an innocent man's day or possibly his life because you have a bad feeling," she shot back. Evan finally spoke up, placing himself between them. "Captain, she's right. We can't do this. We need to call the ground operations manager and explain the situation before we go any further. Let's follow procedure." "I am the procedure," Sterling roared, slamming his hand down on the console. The sudden bang made both Evan and Sarah flinch. "Fine. You want to see procedure? I'll give you procedure." He grabbed the radio handset used to communicate with ground control and the gate. "Gate, C4, this is Captain Sterling of Flight 855. We have a security situation on board. I am refusing to transport a passenger. I need airport security at the aircraft immediately." The radio crackled back, the agent's voice laced with surprise. Copy that, Flight 85. Security is on the way. Can you provide the nature of the threat? The passenger is non-compliant, and I deem him a risk to the safety of the flight." Sterling lied, his voice a cold, authoritative baritone. He was creating a narrative, building a case against a man who was still quietly reading a magazine in seat 2B. In the cabin, the delay was becoming noticeable. Passengers began to murmur. The air conditioning had lessened its flow as the engines remained quiet, and the cabin was growing stuffy. People glanced at their watches, a low wave of collective anxiety beginning to build. David Roberts looked up from his magazine, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. He saw the flight attendants whispering urgently in the forward galley. He saw Sarah Jenkins emerge from the cockpit, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. He saw the other passengers starting to look around, seeking a source for the delay. His posture didn't change, but a switch flipped inside him. He was no longer a passive observer. He was assessing. Minutes later, 2 uniformed airport security officers appeared at the forward cabin door. The lead officer, a burly man in his late 40s, with Officer Miller on his name tag, stepped onto the plane, his partner right behind him. The sight of uniforms immediately silenced the cabin. Phones, which had been put away, were surreptitiously pulled out. The soft red glow of recording lights began to dot the rows. Officer Miller conferred briefly with Sarah, who pointed reluctantly toward seat 2B. He then began to walk down the aisle, his heavy boots thudding on the carpet. The atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. Every eye was on him, and then on the man he was approaching. Miller stopped next to row 12. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," he said, his voice attempting a neutral tone, but failing to hide the underlying command. David Roberts slowly folded his magazine and placed it in the seat back pocket. He looked up at the officer, his expression calm, almost curious. "On what grounds, officer?" he asked, his voice even and clear, carrying easily through the silent cabin. "The captain of the aircraft has refused you passage," Miller stated, falling back on the authority of the pilot. "We can discuss the details off the plane." "I see," Roberts said, not moving. "The captain has refused me passage. Did the captain give you a reason for this refusal?" Miller hesitated. Sterling's radio call had been vague but urgent. "He identified you as a security risk, sir. Now please, let's not make a scene. Just gather your bag and come with me." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Roberts replied calmly. He wasn't being defiant. He was stating a fact. "I have done nothing to warrant being labeled a security risk. I have broken no laws. I have not violated any airline policy. Therefore, I will not be deplaning." The standoff was now absolute. A passenger, calmly defying a security officer who was acting on the orders of a captain who was acting on pure, unadulterated prejudice. The passengers were captivated, a mixture of fear, indignation, and morbid curiosity on their faces. In the cockpit, Sterling listened to the exchange via the open cockpit door, a grim smile on his face. This was exactly what he wanted. The man was non-compliant. It justified everything. "See," he hissed at Evan. "I told you, he's a problem." Evan just shook his head, a sense of dread washing over him. This was a train wreck in slow motion, and Captain Sterling was gleefully shoveling coal into the engine. Back in the cabin, Officer Miller's patience was wearing thin. The eyes and cameras of 200 passengers were on him. "Sir," he said, his voice hardening, "I'm not asking you again. You will come with me now, or I will be forced to remove you." David Roberts held the officer's gaze. A flicker of something, not fear, but perhaps disappointment, crossed his features. He let out a soft sigh, as if a tiresome but necessary part of his day had finally arrived. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice dropping slightly, but losing none of its clarity. "You and your captain are making a monumental mistake. You are interfering with matters you do not understand. Now, before you escalate this any further, I suggest you get your direct supervisor and the highest-ranking airline official at this airport down to this gate, immediately." Miller was taken aback by the man's sheer audacity. "And who are you to be making suggestions like that?" David Roberts, slowly, deliberately, reached into the inside pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. The movement was so smooth and controlled that no one perceived it as a threat. He did not pull out a weapon. He did not pull out a passport. He pulled out a leather bifold wallet. He flipped it open, and pinned to the smooth black leather was a gleaming gold badge. Next to it, encased in protective plastic, was a set of credentials. "Special Agent David Roberts," he announced, his voice now ringing with an authority that dwarfed everyone else's on the plane. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am on official, time-sensitive government business. And your captain," he added, his eyes flicking for a moment toward the cockpit, "is now obstructing a federal investigation." The silence that fell over the cabin of Flight 815 was absolute and profound. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the plane. The low hum of the auxiliary power unit seemed to roar into the vacuum. Passengers, who had been filming on their phones, froze their devices, still pointed at the unfolding drama, their mouths agape. Officer Miller stared at the gold badge, his brain struggling to process the information. The bold letters FBI seemed to burn into his retinas. His professional bluster evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, prickling fear. He had gone from being an agent of authority to a man who had just threatened to forcibly remove a federal agent from an airplane. His face, which had been flush with agitation, turned a pasty, sickly white. I, he stammered, taking an involuntary step back. Agent Roberts did not gloat. He did not raise his voice. He simply held the credentials steady for Miller to see clearly. "Officer Miller," he said, his tone still even, but now imbued with the full weight of federal law. "Your communication device, use it. Contact your supervisor, explain the situation, and tell them to get down here. You will also contact the tower and have them relay a message to the airline's operations center. I want the station manager at this gate in 5 minutes. Miller fumbled for his radio, his hands shaking. Dispatch, this is Miller at gate C34. I need a supervisor on site immediately. The situation has changed. It's federal. The panic in his voice was unmistakable. In the forward galley, Sarah Jenkins leaned against a counter, her legs feeling weak. She looked from the stunned security officer to the impossibly calm man in seat 12B, and then toward the cockpit door, behind which sat the man who had caused all of this. A wave of vindication washed over her quickly, followed by a sense of dread for the storm that was about to break. Inside the cockpit, Evan Hayes had heard every word. He looked at Captain Sterling, whose smug expression had vanished, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. FBI, Sterling choked out his voice, a hoarse whisper. He's lying. It's a fake. It has to be a fake. A fake, Evan said, his voice dripping with scorn. Rick, do you honestly believe someone would try to pass off a fake FBI badge to airport security on an airplane? Do you hear how insane that sounds? You accused an FBI agent of being a terrorist. My God, what have you done? Sterling's mind was racing, trying to find a way out of the box he had built around himself. He didn't declare himself. He's supposed to declare himself if he's armed. First of all, you don't know if he's armed, Evan countered, his voice rising. And second, even if he is, they only have to declare the weapon, not their identity, unless there's a specific security directive. You didn't ask if he was law enforcement. You didn't ask anything. You just saw a black man in a nice suit and decided he was a threat. You didn't follow a single procedure. You just let your bigotry fly the plane. The accusation hung in the air, raw and undeniable. Sterling had no response. The fortress of his authority, built on decades of command and prejudice, was crumbling around him. The gut feeling he had trusted so implicitly had just led him off a cliff. The minutes that followed were excruciatingly slow. Officer Miller and his partner stood awkwardly in the aisle, pointedly not looking at Agent Roberts, waiting for backup. Roberts himself had put his credentials away and now sat patiently, the very picture of composure. He was in complete control. He didn't need to say another word. Soon, a gaggle of officials hurried down the jet bridge. First came Miller's supervisor, a stern-faced captain from the airport police department. He was followed by Amelia Vance, the Trans-American Airways Atlanta station manager. A sharp woman in her 50s, whose face was a thunderous mask of controlled fury. Vance boarded the plane, her eyes sweeping the cabin, taking in the scene, the security officers, the silent watching passengers, and the man in seat 2B. She walked directly to him. Sir, she began, her voice low and urgent. I am Amelia Vance, the station manager for the airline. I cannot begin to apologize enough for this situation. There has been a grievous misunderstanding. Agent Roberts looked up at her. Ms. Vance, he said, his tone professional but cold. It's a little past a misunderstanding. Your captain, acting on motives I can only assume are profoundly unprofessional, has singled me out, attempted to have me illegally removed from this aircraft, and in doing so has compromised a federal operation and delayed me from reaching my destination. Vance winced at every word. I understand, Agent Roberts. Completely. What can we do to rectify this? First, Roberts said, this flight is not going anywhere with that man in the cockpit. His judgment is compromised. I do not feel safe, and frankly, none of these passengers should feel safe knowing he is in command. He gestured around the cabin. Second, your captain has created a public spectacle and has drawn unwanted attention to me. My anonymity was crucial. That is now gone. My current travel arrangements are therefore compromised. Of course, we will arrange an immediate alternative for you, whatever you need, Vance said quickly. A private charter the next flight out with a different routing. Anything. We'll discuss the logistics of that off the plane, Roberts said. For now, I need you to deal with your employee. He nodded toward the cockpit. And I will require the full unredacted names of the entire flight crew for my report. I will be filing a formal complaint with the airline, the FAA, and my superiors will be logging this incident as an act of interference against a federal agent. Each sentence was a hammer blow outlining the bureaucratic and legal nightmare that was just beginning for Captain Sterling and Trans-American Airways. Amelia Vance straightened up and took a deep breath. Her expression hardened. The time for apologies was over. Now it was time for damage control. She turned to the airport police captain. Captain, I am officially removing the pilot from this flight. I will need you to escort him from the aircraft. Then, she walked the few steps to the cockpit door and pushed it open without knocking. Sterling and Evan both looked up. Vance's eyes were blazing. She didn't look at Evan. She fixed her gaze entirely on Rick Sterling, who seemed to shrink in his chair. Captain Sterling, she said, her voice dripping with ice, gather your personal belongings. You are being relieved of command effective immediately. Your flight status is suspended pending a full investigation. An escort is waiting to walk you off my aircraft. Sterling stared at her, his face a mixture of shock, humiliation, and pathetic defiance. You can't do this. I am the captain of this. You were the captain. Vance cut him off, her voice like steel. Right now you are a liability. I am removing from the payroll. Get your things now. She turned and walked away, leaving the door open for all to see. The moment of truth had arrived. Captain Richard Sterling, the man whose authority was absolute just 30 minutes ago, had to perform the ultimate walk of shame. He slowly, numbly unbuckled his harness. He avoided looking at Evan, who was staring at him with undisguised contempt. He grabbed his flight bag. As he stepped out of the cockpit and into the cabin, a hush fell. Every single passenger watched as the decorated pilot, the man they had entrusted with their lives, was flanked by the airport police captain. He kept his eyes down, but he could feel the 200 pairs of eyes on him, burning with judgment. He could see the phones still recording his humiliation. He walked past Seattleby, not daring to look at the man he had wronged, the catalyst for his professional ruin. As he reached the forward door and stepped onto the jet bridge, a passenger in the back of the plane started a slow, sarcastic clap. Another joined in, and then another. It wasn't a full-blown applause, but a scattered, mocking percussion that followed Captain Rick Sterling all the way out of the aircraft and out of the career he had built his entire identity around. The removal of Captain Sterling from Flight 815 was like pulling the pin from a grenade. The immediate explosion was his public humiliation, but the shrapnel was just beginning to fly, tearing through the airline's operations and reputation. Amelia Vance stood at the front of the cabin, her posture ramrod straight, as she addressed the stunned passengers over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the airline's station manager. On behalf of Trans-American Airways, I want to offer my deepest and most sincere apologies for the unacceptable delay and the distressing events you have just witnessed. The actions of the now former captain of this flight are not reflective of the values or standards of this airline. We are arranging for a new flight crew to take command, but this will unfortunately result in a significant delay. We will be providing meal vouchers and will automatically be issuing significant travel credits to every passenger on this flight for your patience and understanding. Her voice was calm and measured, a masterclass in corporate damage control, but behind the professional veneer, a storm of frantic activity was erupting. On her phone, she was coordinating with operations to scramble a replacement captain and first officer, a task that could take hours. She was simultaneously dictating a preliminary report to the airline's legal department and fielding calls from increasingly senior executives who had been alerted to a code red incident involving the FBI. Agent Roberts was escorted off the plane by the airport police captain, not as a suspect, but as a protected asset. They took him to a private lounge away from prying eyes. Inside, Roberts finally allowed his professional mask to slip just for a moment. He ran a hand over his face, the exhaustion of the ordeal settling in. His mission in Seattle involved apprehending a high-level figure in an international fraud ring. The timing was critical. Sterling's actions hadn't just been an inconvenience. They had genuinely jeopardized years of investigative work. "I need a secure line and a sterile flight plan," Roberts told the police captain and Amelia Vance, who had joined them. "My office is taking over my travel arrangements. They'll be in touch." Vance could only nod. "Whatever you need, Agent. We will cooperate fully." The subtext was clear. "Please don't let the full might of the U.S. Department of Justice come down on our airline." Back on the plane, Evan Hayes found himself in the surreal position of being the senior authority figure. He worked with Sarah Jenkins and the rest of the flight crew to keep the passengers calm, answering questions as best he could without violating protocol. He was hailed as a hero by several passengers who had overheard his attempts to reason with Sterling. "You tried to stop him," one man in first class said, shaking Evan's hand. "We all heard it. Thank you." Evan felt a flush of relief, but it was overshadowed by the gravity of the situation. He knew the investigation to come would be intense. He began meticulously documenting every single detail of the incident in the flight log, from Sterling's first comment to his final racist roar of "I am the procedure." He noted the exact times the words used and his and Sarah's responses. He was no longer just a co-pilot, he was the star witness. Meanwhile, Rick Sterling was in a sterile interrogation room in the airport's security wing. The airport police captain and an airline security executive questioned him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate defensive posture. "I was acting in the interest of safety," Sterling insisted, his voice raspy. "I had a bad feeling about him. A pilot's intuition is a critical tool. For all I knew, he could have been part of a cell." The airline executive, a former pilot named Peterson, cut him off. "A bad feeling, Rick, or a prejudice? Let's be honest. The man was a black passenger in a suit. That's all you saw. You didn't see his veteran's pin on his lapel. You didn't notice that his magazine was The Economist. You just saw his skin color and decided he didn't belong. You didn't follow a single protocol for assessing a threat. You went straight to removal. You abused your command, you endangered this airline's relationship with the federal government, and you humiliated yourself and this company in front of 200 passengers with camera phones." Sterling flinched at the mention of the cameras. The reality of the modern world, a world he so clearly disdained, was crashing down on him. The videos were almost certainly already spreading online. The name Richard Sterling would soon be infamous. "He was non-compliant," Sterling offered, weakly clinging to his last shred of justification. "He was asserting his rights," Peterson countered. "And as it turns out, his rights were backed by the full force of the FBI. You picked a fight with the one person on that plane you absolutely could not beat." Sterling slumped in his chair. The fight had gone out of him. The collapse was total. He wasn't a captain anymore. He wasn't an authority figure. He was just a middle-aged man in a uniform he no longer had the right to wear, sitting in a windowless room. His life's work smouldering in ruins around him. He thought of his pension, his prestigious standing in his community, the respect he had always commanded. It was all turning to ash. By the time a replacement crew arrived 3 hours later, the story was already a trending topic on social media. The hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack was attached to dozens of grainy videos of the confrontation. News outlets were picking up the story, quoting anonymous passengers and citing an incident involving a pilot and a federal agent. Trans-American Airways stock took a slight but noticeable dip in after-hours trading. Their PR department issued a carefully worded statement confirming a pilot had been removed from service and that an investigation was underway, emphasizing their commitment to diversity and non-discrimination. It was corporate jargon designed to staunch the bleeding, but everyone knew the truth. As the new captain, a calm and professional woman named Captain Eva Rostova finally powered up the engines of Flight 815, she made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your new captain speaking. We are finally ready for departure. We know it's been a long and difficult day, and we appreciate your incredible patience. Let's get you to Seattle safely." The plane finally taxied away from the gate more than 4 hours behind schedule. Evan Hayes sat in the right-hand seat, assisting Captain Rostova. He felt a profound sense of relief as the wheels left the tarmac. They were finally flying away from the scene of the disaster. But for Rick Sterling, the disaster was just beginning to unfold. He had not only lost command of his airplane, he had lost command of his life. And he was in a free fall with no parachute. The days and weeks following the incident at Gate C-34 were a brutal education for Rick Sterling in the concept of consequences. His swift and ignominious fall from grace was not confined to the whispers of the airline industry. It became a national story, a case study in modern-day prejudice and the abuse of power. The internal investigation by Trans-American Airways was swift and merciless. Amelia Vance's team interviewed every single crew member of Flight 815. Evan Hayes and Sarah Jenkins provided calm, detailed, and damning testimony. They handed over their written reports, which corroborated each other perfectly. Evan's log detailed Sterling's prejudiced remarks from the moment he first saw Agent Roberts, while Sarah recounted her refusal to carry out an order she knew was discriminatory. Both were officially commended in their files for their integrity and professionalism. The airline's legal team saw them not as rogue employees, but as key assets in mitigating the catastrophic damage Sterling had caused. The passenger videos were the nail in the coffin. Pieced together, they formed a clear narrative. They showed Agent Roberts' calm demeanor, Officer Miller's initial by-the-book approach, and the stunning reveal of the FBI credentials. Most damningly, they captured the audio of Sterling's replacement, Amelia Vance, stating he was being removed for his actions. There was no ambiguity. Less than a week after the incident, Rick Sterling was summoned to the Trans-American corporate headquarters. It wasn't a negotiation or a hearing. He sat in a polished boardroom opposite three stone-faced executives from legal, human resources, and flight operations. Richard Sterling, the head of HR, began reading from a prepared statement. Following a thorough investigation into the events of July 23rd aboard Flight 815, Trans-American Airways has found you in gross violation of company policy, including but not limited to crew resource management protocols, anti-discrimination policies, and the code of conduct for a pilot in command. Your actions demonstrated a profound lack of judgment, endangered the airline's operational integrity, and were rooted in demonstrable racial bias. Sterling started to speak to protest, but the executive held up a hand. "This is not a debate. Your employment with Trans-American Airways is terminated effective immediately. Due to the nature of your dismissal for gross misconduct, you will forfeit your company-contributed pension funds and all future flight benefits." The words hit him like a physical blow. His pension, decades of work gone. He was being financially as well as professionally executed. But the airline was the least of his problems. The Federal Aviation Administration launched its own investigation. Citing the evidence from the airline and the formal complaint filed by the FBI, they scheduled a hearing to review his airline transport pilot license. The FAA's mandate is safety, and their conclusion was chillingly simple: a pilot who allows personal prejudice to so catastrophically cloud his judgment represents a fundamental threat to air safety. They revoked his license. At 58, Rick Sterling was legally barred from ever again acting as a pilot for a commercial airline in the United States. His career wasn't just over, it was salted earth. The Department of Justice, on behalf of the FBI, sent a formal letter to the airline and the FAA. While they chose not to press criminal charges for obstruction, a move likely intended to avoid further publicizing the details of Agent Roberts' mission, the letter was a scathing indictment of Sterling's behavior. It made clear that his actions had caused significant operational disruption to a national security matter. This letter became part of the permanent record, a black mark that would follow Sterling everywhere. The public fallout was just as brutal. His name and picture were everywhere for a week on cable news, in newspapers, and across the internet. He became a meme, a symbol of entitled bigotry. His quiet, affluent suburban community was suddenly home to a pariah. Neighbors, who once greeted him with respect, now crossed the street to avoid him. His wife faced whispers and stares at the grocery store. The comfortable, respected life he had built was shattered. He tried to fight back, hiring a lawyer and threatening a wrongful termination lawsuit. But his lawyer, after reviewing the mountain of evidence against him, strongly advised him to drop it. "Rick, there's no case here," the attorney told him bluntly. "You have video evidence, the testimony of your entire crew, a formal complaint from the FBI, and your own words logged against you. You take this to court, and a jury will destroy you. You'll be financially ruined, beyond what you've already lost." 6 months after the incident, Rick Sterling was a ghost of his former self. The crisp uniform was gone, replaced by the rumpled clothes of a man with nowhere to go. The authoritative jaw was perpetually covered in grey stubble. He applied for jobs, consulting roles, simulator instructor positions, even jobs with small cargo carriers in remote locations. But his name was toxic. The moment a background check was run, the story of Flight 815 would surface, and the door would be politely but firmly shut. One afternoon, he was sitting in his car in a shopping plaza parking lot waiting for his wife. A plane flew overhead, a big Boeing 777 glinting in the sun as it climbed toward its cruising altitude. He watched it until it was just a silver speck, a symbol of a world he was permanently locked out of. It wasn't just a job he had lost. It was his identity, his purpose, everything he had ever been. He had been the king of his own small kingdom in the sky, and in a single ugly act of prejudice, he had dethroned himself and banished himself to the wilderness. There was no appeal, no second chance. It was a life sentence of his own making. Meanwhile, Agent David Roberts had successfully completed his mission in Seattle, his travel discreetly rearranged by the Bureau. First Officer Evan Hayes was put on the fast track for a captain's upgrade, his actions seen as the gold standard for co-pilot responsibility. Sarah Jenkins received a commendation and a promotion to cabin service manager. They had all faced a test that day, and they had passed. Rick Sterling had faced the same test, and his failure was absolute, a long, hard fall back to Earth, with no landing gear to soften the impact. 2 years passed. The world, with its insatiable appetite for new outrages, moved on. The story of Flight 815 faded from the headlines, becoming another piece of digital archaeology for those who cared to search for it. But for the people at the heart of the storm, the events of that day were not a fleeting story. They were a defining moment that sent ripples through the rest of their lives. Captain Evan Hayes sat in the left-hand seat of a brand-new Airbus A350, the sprawling, glittering expanse of the Chicago skyline visible off his port wing. The 4 stripes on his epaulets felt natural, now earned not just through flight hours and examinations, but through a trial by fire in a parked Boeing 777. His first officer, a bright young woman named Chloe, pointed to a weather display showing a rapidly developing thunderstorm over Lake Michigan, directly in their path to Jeff Kerm. "Looks like that cell is intensifying faster than forecast, Captain." Chloe noted, her tone calm and professional. "We could try to punch through the gap to the north, but it's closing. Rerouting south will add 20 minutes to our flight time." Evan studied the display. He could hear Rick Sterling's voice in his memory, a ghost in the machine. "Don't let some weather geek on the ground tell you how to fly. We go through." Sterling saw any deviation as weakness, any collaboration as a challenge to his authority. Evan tapped the screen, tracing the southern route. "No, we're not threading any needles today. Safety over schedule, always. Let's start a gentle turn south. Advise ATC of our deviation for weather and inform the cabin. Tell them we're taking the scenic route to give them a smoother ride and we expect about a 20-minute delay. Be transparent. Yes, Captain, Chloe replied, already keying in the request to air traffic control. As the magnificent aircraft banked smoothly to the south, Evan felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The culture at Transamerican had subtly but significantly shifted after the Sterling incident. A new training module, unofficially called the C-34 Protocol by crew members, was now mandatory for all flight staff. It empowered and protected any crew member who challenged a command they believed to be unlawful, discriminatory, or unsafe. The captain is king mentality was being actively dismantled in favor of a collaborative, crew is a team ethos. Evan, with his first-hand experience, had become one of its most powerful advocates. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a leader, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that his authority came not from his chair, but from the trust of the people who sat beside and behind him. Sarah Jenkins stood before a class of 20 new hire flight attendants in a mock cabin at the Transamerican Training Center in Dallas. Her new role as a lead instructor in crew resource management fit her perfectly. Her poise and unwavering moral compass made her a natural teacher. "Okay, scenario time," she said, her voice clear and engaging. "You are at the gate. The captain, as senior pilot with a flawless record, instructs you to remove a passenger before departure. He gives you no specific reason other than a bad feeling. The passenger is calm, compliant, and has done nothing wrong. What do you do?" A young man in the front row raised his hand. "We follow the captain's orders," he asked, uncertainty in his voice. Sarah offered him a kind smile. "That used to be the reflexive answer, but it's the wrong one. Your first duty is to the safety and security of everyone on board. That includes protecting passengers from harassment or wrongful removal. Your first step is to ask the captain for a specific, actionable reason. A bad feeling is not one. If he can't provide one, you have the right and the responsibility to refuse the order and immediately request a consultation with the ground manager and the chief pilot on duty. You are never ever required to enforce discrimination." She let the weight of her words settle in the room. A few years ago, a situation very much like this one happened on one of our flights. A brave flight attendant and first officer did exactly what I just described. They stood their ground. It was difficult, it was stressful, but it was right. Their actions didn't just save one passenger from humiliation, they changed this entire airline for the better. Never forget that you are not just service providers, you are safety professionals. You are the last line of defense for decency at 35,000 feet. Agent David Roberts sat on a park bench near the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., a cup of coffee in his hand. He was older now, the lines around his eyes a little deeper. He had recently accepted a promotion to a supervisory role at headquarters, a move that meant fewer frantic flights and more time mentoring the next generation. A young agent he was advising fresh from Quantico sat beside him. "So that fraud ring you took down in Seattle," the young agent said, his voice full of admiration. "The takedown was perfect. Time to the minute. Did everything go exactly as planned?" Roberts took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes on the Washington Monument piercing the sky. He thought of the stale, recycled air of Flight 815, of Officer Miller's shocked face, of Rick Sterling's impotent rage. "No," Roberts said quietly. "Nothing ever goes exactly as planned. The most dangerous variable is never the subject you're pursuing. It's always the human element you don't see coming." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "My travel to Seattle was nearly compromised by an unforeseen complication. A personnel issue with the airline. The whole operation, years of work, could have been lost." "What did you do?" the young agent asked, leaning in. "I didn't have to do much," Roberts replied, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. A couple of people I'd never met before, a co-pilot and a flight attendant, decided to do their jobs with integrity. They chose to be decent human beings instead of just following improper orders. They saved the day. "You'll learn, son," he said, turning to the young agent, "that you can't control everything, but you can trust that on most days, in most places, there are good people who will do the right thing. And sometimes, that's all the backup you need." Rick Sterling unlocked the gate to a desolate, windswept trucking depot in the industrial outskirts of Atlanta. His 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift as a security guard was a lonely, silent vigil. The crisp pilot's uniform had been replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting polyester one with a generic eagle eye security patch on the shoulder. He did his rounds, the crunch of his boots on the gravel, the only sound besides the distant hum of the interstate. He was a man adrift, haunted by the ghost of the life he'd torpedoed. His wife had eventually left him, weary of the shame and the shell of a man he had become. He lived in a small, cheap apartment, the walls bare. Around 3 a.m., he sat in the cramped break room, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee. He unwrapped a sandwich as a small, flickering television on a shelf played a 24-hour news channel on mute. A commercial came on. It was for Trans-American Airways. The ad was bright, optimistic, and full of diverse faces, passengers of all races, smiling flight attendants, and confident pilots. For a split second, the camera focused on a captain, confidently striding through a terminal, greeting his crew. It was Evan Hayes. Rick Sterling froze his sandwich halfway to his mouth. He stared at the face of the man who had warned him. The man who now sat in the seat that should have been his. The ad ended with a new slogan appearing over a majestic shot of a plane. Soaring through the clouds, Trans-American Airways, a higher standard. Sterling didn't move. He just stared at the blank screen. The image of Evan's success and the airline's aspirational message burned into his mind. There was no anger left, no defiance. There was only a vast, empty chasm of regret. He was the reason that slogan existed. He was the old standard against which the new one was measured. He slowly, mechanically took a bite of his sandwich. It tasted like ash. Outside, the wind howled, and another night of his long, quiet reckoning stretched on before him. In the end, the story of Flight 815 serves as a stark and powerful reminder that authority is not a right, but a responsibility. Captain Sterling believed the uniform and the title gave him absolute power, but he learned that true authority is earned through judgment, integrity, and respect, all of which he abandoned. He wasn't brought down by a complex conspiracy or a stroke of bad luck. He was the architect of his own ruin, brought down by a single ugly prejudice that he allowed to overrule his training, his duty, and his humanity. The quiet professionalism of Agent David Roberts, the integrity of Evan Hayes, and the courage of Sarah Jenkins stand as a testament to the fact that doing the right thing, especially when it's hard, is the only true measure of character. The sky is vast, but it has no room for small-minded hate. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, please consider hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who might appreciate it, and subscribing to our channel for more real-life dramatic storytelling. Your support helps us continue to find and share these powerful narratives. Let us know in the comments what you think. Who was the true hero on that flight? We'd love to hear your thoughts.